Hello and welcome to World Talks here on TVP World. Every word matters. My name is Anna Kalczyńska. European leaders warned they would respond firmly to higher levies on steel and aluminium, but they had yet to say what that retaliation against the United States would look like. Donald Trump has said his latest tariffs will take effect on 12th of March without exceptions or exemptions. Is the EU going to retaliate and wage yet another trade war? To elaborate further on this issue, I'm joined now by Zsolt Darvas, Senior Fellow, Bruegel. Good evening. Good morning, sir.
Good morning. Thank you very much for the invitation.
So, as we learned, the US is a major steel importer, let alone the effects on the American market the tariffs are going to have. Let's focus on Europe. The US was the second largest market for EU exports of iron and steel, and European companies will obviously lose their comparative advantage, but the EU leaders vow to respond. So let's take a listen of what Olaf Scholz had to say.
I have already mentioned the American tariffs that we may initially face on steel and aluminum. If the US leaves us no other choice, then the European Union will react in unison. As the largest market in the world, with 450 million citizens, we have the strength to do so. I hope, however, that we will be spared the misguided path of tariffs and counter-tariffs. In the end, trade wars always cost both sides prosperity.
Exactly. So this is a lose-lose war. And is Europe ready to retaliate? We hear only that we are going to act in unison. And in light of Donald Trump's announcement that the counter-retaliation measures will follow, is this a good move?
I think we should first look at what happened during the first Trump administration, when also President Trump introduced tariffs on steel and aluminium. And that was followed by a threat of introducing further tariffs on various other European products, including cars. But at the end, there was a negotiation, and President Juncker, who was the president of the Commission at that time, could reach an agreement with Donald Trump. Both sides agreed to cooperate. The tariffs on cars was avoided. And I think something similar could happen this time as well. At least this is my hope. And also, as I hear from Olaf Scholz, this is also his hope, that certainly now negotiations will start between the United States and the European Union. I mean, one issue is obviously the tariff on steel and aluminium. But what is even more worrisome is that President Trump indicated that he would impose an across-the-board tariff on all kinds of products from Europe. So yes, we need to see, but I do think that if an agreement will not be reached, then indeed European countries will act together, and they will find ways to retaliate.
So what, according to you, is in the background of this negotiation? What is exactly the issue, and what would United States want in return for taking these tariffs off?
So one of the side comments of President Trump when he announced the new tariffs on steel and aluminium was that he would impose tariffs the same level as other countries impose tariffs on US goods. For example, if you look at passenger cars, the US tariff rate on cars coming from the EU to the US is just about 2.5%. But the EU tariff rate on passenger cars coming from the US to Europe is higher at 10%. So this would mean that, Donald Trump would want to have the same tariff rate, for example, not just on cars, but on all kinds of products. So one option for the EU would be either to reduce, the tariff rate on cars and also on all other products on which the EU applies a higher rate. So I think this would be the demand of Donald Trump. Or to accept that the US will impose, reciprocal, the same kind of tariffs on imported goods from the EU.
So the tariff, 25%, it's a huge tariff imposed on EU products, but it will mainly hit Germany, Italy and Spain. Those are the three countries exporting the majority of the steel to the US. It's absolutely understandable that Olaf Scholz is worried in this respect. How do you think Europe can act, and on which products the tariffs, counter tariffs, could be imposed?
Now, first of all, let me note that the country would most hit will be the United States, in my view, because certainly this 25% tariff will lead to higher steel and aluminum prices in the United States. So all kind of producers, car manufacturers, and all kind of manufacturing production which uses steel and aluminum will face higher prices. And, this will also ultimately result on higher prices on manufacturing products sold in the US, will lead to higher inflation. Higher inflation will lead to higher interest rate by the Federal Reserve. So I think the countries that will be mostly hit will be the United States itself. But coming back to Europe, I mean, what will be important from the European Union side that it should act according to the EU's international commitments, including its participation in the World Trade Organization. So all retaliatory measures should be in line with that. But I think the most possible scenario outlook is that the EU would impose retaliatory tariffs on certain products which are very important, very sensitive for the United States. Another option is obviously all these big US high-tech digital companies, which have a lots of operation in Europe. Again, Europe can threaten to tighten all kind of regulation and also taxation of these big US digital companies. So indeed, I think the European response will be selective, in line with World Trade Organizations and rules, and will target items, services and goods, which are the most important, which are very important for the US and for President Trump.
Understood. So a selective measure on different areas of goods and a legal action in front of the WTO. Previously, the European Union also challenged the tariffs imposed on Europe at the World Trade Organization. By the way, remains to also judge the effects of such legal action, because they will be probably completely disregarded as previously by the US. So do you agree that those tariffs imposed by Trump are more about political strategy than economic necessity, and that it's basically aimed at rallying domestic support for Donald Trump?
So somehow Donald Trump has an obsession against the US trade deficit, meaning that the United States imports more than the amount of goods the United States exports, and he somehow thinks that this is a bad thing or bad for the US economy. But unfortunately, this is completely wrong. If a country imports more than what it exports, it means that there is more domestic consumption and investment than the amount of goods produced by the country. So this is an excellent situation, Now, certainly the flip side of that is that if a country imports more than it exports, then it has to borrow from abroad to finance that trade deficit. But the US in this regard has a very privileged position, because the United States has the US dollar, which is the number one global currency. There is a huge demand for US dollars from central banks, investors, private and public alike. And this also means that when countries or companies lend to the United States, they often purchase US government securities, US treasuries, which typically has a relatively low yield. So the US pays a relatively low interest rate on its foreign borrowing. While at the same time, when US investors invest abroad, they typically do foreign direct investment and other capital investments, and they earn a lot. So it has been well established on the economics literature that the return on US foreign assets abroad is much higher than the return that foreigners earn on their US assets. So what I would like to emphasize is that even if the US as a country as a whole has to borrow from abroad to finance its trade deficit, it is largely sustainable because the US has, a much more profitable investments abroad than what foreigners earn in the US. And this means that, the US trade deficit is sustainable. There is no problem with it. So I really, as an economist, I don't understand why this is a huge problem for President Trump, that the US has a trade deficit.
So just quickly, as we need to wrap up, what is the long-term effect in your mind that this could have on the global scene and landscape? Will it trigger EU, for instance, to look for potentially other major partners in the world, like China, for instance?
So a trade war would be bad for everyone, the US, Europe, China, all countries. It would lead to higher prices, therefore also higher interest rates, which would also spill over to Europe and the rest of the world, would lead to lower output, lower GDP. So I think from a trade war, all countries will likely lose. Now, you asked about the China relation. I mean, that's a very delicate issue because also President Trump is very much against imports from China and more generally against the Chinese production and the technological advances of that country. So, for example, but also the EU has, sometimes problem with China in certain regards. I mean, you can just recall the stated issues on electric vehicles, and that the European Commission proposed to impose tariffs on imported cars from China to the European Union. So one thing, for example, in which the EU and the US could cooperate is to have a joint action against, for example, unjustified state aid in China and elsewhere. And this could help EU-US cooperation, might reduce the tensions between the United States and Europe. And at the same time, it might also, counter the excessive state aid which is provided in China.
Thank you so much, Zsolt Darvas, Senior Fellow, Bruegel, was our guest this morning. Thank you once again. And thank you for watching World Talks. And please stay tuned to TVP World for more information.